and I'm the director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Heritage at the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment. And I've forgotten, I think this is our 12th year of running these lectures, which are held once a month during term time. And they are the Nigel Seeley Memorial Lectures, and Nigel Seeley was head of conservation at the UCL Institute for Archaeology, where I and several of you were students and were taught by Nigel Seeley until his untimely death. And we commemorate him because of the cross-disciplinary nature of his research interests, and also because we try to emulate his work. And it's my great pleasure for our inaugural lecture this year to welcome Professor Sue Hamilton. And I'd like to say a few words about Sue, who is Professor of Prehistory and Director of the UCL Institute for Archaeology. Her work focuses on the social and sensory construction of landscapes by prehistoric societies. Her research has concentrated on later prehistoric settlement and landscape in Europe, and for more than a decade, the archaeology of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, which is the subject of her talk this evening. She has led larger scale multidisciplinary landscape projects in the UK, southern Italy and Rapa Nui, and currently is principal investigator of the AHRC Rapa Nui Landscapes of Construction project. Her books include Stone Worlds, Narrative and Reflexivity in Landscape Archaeology, and Archaeology and Women. Welcome.
Thank you, May. Well, I actually find it quite a challenge to lecture to you today, or give my talk. I'm quite used to talking about Rapa Nui in a purely archaeological sense, but I did feel I should say something about heritage and broach in my mind what sustainable heritage is in a Rapa Nui context. So today's lecture is a bit of an experiment, because I'm taking heritage as a lead into the work which we have done, which we didn't start off by thinking of as heritage, we thought of it as archaeology. But actually, as we spent some time working on Rapa Nui, heritage was often a lever to get permission to do anything there. So it became a sort of tool, and a very interesting tool, because it led us to do things that we would not naturally automatically have chosen to do. But in doing those things, we made new discoveries which informed our original research project. So that is a kind of dialogue with heritage that I'm going to attempt to present to you. So one thing about the heritage on Rapa Nui is that it's fast disappearing, and it's disappearing on a huge scale because of the sheer density of prehistory and archaeology on the island. And I'm thinking about heritage as the nuts and bolts of what's there from the past in the landscape, but I also want to think about how people create heritage. Heritage is nothing if you cannot see it. It's nothing under the ground, but through research, excavation, and the visuality of it, and the talking about it, it becomes a heritage. So it's something that can be constructed through the activities of research. And that's something too that I'm very interested in. So its heritage is eroding in many ways, in terms of the concepts people have created of it, in terms of the actual physicality of what's there, and in terms of what's actually battering around it, in terms of landscape issues, but also social issues that are very rapidly changing on that island. So in order to get you to follow this course of interweaving, clearly I have to tell you a little about Rapa Nui. So let me introduce Rapa Nui to you. Rapa Nui is in the Pacific. It's a Pacific island. There are millions of Pacific islands, and the Pacific covers a huge part of the world. It covers some 8 million square kilometres. So within that 8 million square kilometres, there are many dotted islands, and they form clusters. So there's Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. So Rapa Nui is in Polynesia, and out of those clusters, which are conceived in different ways, Polynesia is the most united. It is united by a language, it's united by a seafaring tradition that took cultural elements from island to island. And Rapa Nui is within Polynesia. It's often studied in isolation because, as you will see, it's extremely remote. But it's a disservice to study Rapa Nui on its own. It is part of Rapa Nui heritage, it's part of Polynesian heritage, identity, and ways of doing things. So it's right at the edge of Polynesia, on the eastern tip of the Polynesian Triangle that has Hawaii at the top and New Zealand on the western tip. It's extremely isolated. The nearest island to Rapa Nui is Pitcairn, where the Bounty mutineers went. That's about 2,500 kilometres away. So the nearest small community is that far away. And if you want to hit mainland, the nearest mainland is Chile, South America, and it's 4,500 kilometres away. So this is a unit of heritage that has developed and been investigated and known about in a very, very isolated situation. Why is it part of Polynesia? Well, Polynesians had a tradition of taking up new land through colonisation, and they did it by double-hulled canoes. And each generation would set to sea with their element of the community, with raw materials, and they would travel till they hit land, another island, and colonise. That's how all of Polynesia was colonised. And the first colonisations go right back to 1300 BC, and Rapa Nui is at the end of the line, and it was occupied by Polynesians in double-hulled canoes by about AD 1200. I'd take off the 1000 there. It's quite recently. It's in the Middle Ages in terms of Europe. So we've got an extra naught in there. And they did this. I think it's quite remarkable. They did it against the current, which sounds like sheer stupidity. But if you don't hit land, what do? You give up sailing. You stop rowing, and with hope, you will be drifted back to from whence you came. So in this extreme isolation, what was occupied and what was found? It's a small volcanic island. It's just a little blip in the ocean of the Pacific. It's some 18 by 16 kilometres. It currently has a population of 4,000 people. And it's very, very distinctive as a landscape. It's virtually treeless, which we will discuss, and it's dominated by ancient volcanoes, which are on each of its tips. So it's a volcanic landscape, and those volcanoes are very key divisions on terms of how Rapa Nui was used and the material culture of Rapa Nui. Volcanoes are places where things are quarried. Statues come from volcanoes. The hats of statues come from volcanoes. So the most iconic material culture of Rapa Nui comes from remarkable places. It comes from volcano vents. Rapa Nui, in the recent times, in the 90s, became a UNESCO designated heritage landscape. It's a selected protection. I would say that Rapa Nui can only be looked at as an island whole, but the UNESCO protected landscapes are subdivisions within it. So that's problematic because it makes choices to do with what is heritage to preserve and what is heritage to let go its own way. The island is remarkable for its density and what I would call choreography of interconnected monuments. If you don't study it as a whole, you will never understand the interrelationships and meanings of monuments. I'm particularly, in terms of our research work, focusing on the statue building period. So that's about AD 1200 down to about 1550 AD. So what is this heritage that UNESCO has protected? Rapa Nui is particularly renowned, sorry for the misspelling of renowned, for its iconic monumentality. It's most well known for what you see here. Stone platforms, they're ceremonial platforms called ahu. They're where the ancestors are placed as represented by stone, moai, stone chiefs. At the back of them, there are crematoria where the descendants have been cremated and left. At the front, there are big ramps up to these monuments made of beach stones, and in front, ceremonial plazas. Most of the protection of these sites puts fences just around those platforms, so the interconnected landscape that relates to it are left, and that's an issue, how to deal with how we as archaeologists and how Rapa Nuis understand their monument complexes and the ways in which they've been cut off by fencing in particular parts. Rapa Nui is not dead heritage, it's living heritage. The Rapa Nui communities have beliefs about the monuments which are there. So they're not just something on the side, there's something that they have such strong beliefs about that it affects how we work as archaeologists. You are not allowed to mount the ramp of the ceremonial platform, you're not allowed to touch the statues, you're not meant to go around the back of the monuments where the dead were cremated. So it's fine to think you can do a survey of one of these monuments, but the answer is you can't, because you can't measure it, you can't walk up to it. There's all sorts of things you would wish to do in an archaeological survey which are opposed on the island. Even if you had permission from outside to do it, they are opposed on the island. So it's living heritage, it's not heritage on its side. That living heritage has many stories attached to it, and they're Western stories. Rapa Nui was occupied from AD 1200, and it took until 1722 for Rapa Nui to be discovered to Europeans, to Westerners. And it was discovered on Easter Day, so this is its more famous name, by Jacob Ruben. He called it Easter Island, and he describes it. And from that moment onwards, it's brought from prehistory into history, because the monuments were built in a period without writing, a period without metal, a period without pottery. It's a very stone-based technology. And once you get Europeans visiting, you have stories about Rapa Nui. And that is how the heritage has actually been created, by the finding and describing of things. So it's described on arrival as a wasteland of barren rock, not a single tree more than 3 meters high, which is an extraordinary thing if you travel through Polynesian islands. They're thick with vegetation. There's something different about Rapa Nui. Various travellers through the 1700s, the 1800s, they'll describe the monuments. And they describe some standing statues, but most of them not there. Most of them collapsed. So there's some story developing there. No trees, collapsed monuments. We don't know how many people were there. Early travellers estimate. They estimate recurrently about 6,000 people. So it's a sort of guess, but let's take it, 6,000 people. As we get into the early 20th century, we get the first real documentation of the island. So the first heritage narrative that's based on data documentation. And it's the work of Catherine Routledge. She went with her husband. They commissioned a schooner called Manor. They went across Polynesia, and when they got to Easter Island, they stayed there for 17 months. and they mapped the island. And it's particularly Routledge's work and her informant, Juan Tipano. And they together mapped that island. It's a combination of anthropology, interviews, questioning people, and the most amazing drawings. So that begins an Easter Island that's much more of a sort of contemporary heritage framework that you can work in. And the interesting thing is the number of people. They knew the number. They were there for 17 months. It's 250 people. So what has happened? So you get this narrative of the missing population, some disaster or something that has caused that decline in population. It also creates a narrative problem, because if you use their work to create ideas about the past of Rapa Nui, the deep time of Rapa Nui, there's only 250 people to make that link backwards in time to the 1200s or whatever. So that's brilliant work, and it was published in a book by Routledge called The Mystery of Easter Island. And it's so seminal she put that word mystery on it, because right down to the present you'll have books that talk about the mystery of Easter Island. And the mystery is what it's all about. Why are there no trees? Why are there such a small population? Chile took ownership, or took over Rapa Nui in the late 1800s. It was annexed in 1888 by Chile. And they had little to do with the island. They had little use for it. So they rented it. And they rented it to a Chilean company that was owned by a company in Chile that was Scottish owned. And the company was Williamson Balfour. And they stayed there into the 50s. And what happened to Rapa Nui? Everybody was moved into a village called Hangaroa, and the rest of the land was for sheep. So that entire landscape that was filled with monuments that Catherine Routledge had mapped, etc., is now off bounds. It's on bounds for sheep, it's on bounds for the herders, but it's off bound to the community. And this is quite a remarkable picture, because they are actually standing on an ahu, one of those dilapidated ceremonial monuments. And they're driving the sheep down the causeways at the back of those ceremonial monuments that are canoe runs down to the sea. So they're using their heritage as convenient ways of getting sheep to water. It did good and bad things. It was terrible that the community was taken off their land, but what it left was an untouched heritage landscape. People were taken out of it, so it's a landscape that is filled with many things that are left relatively undisturbed and modified. So there's a whole prehistoric landscape in stone out there that has got relatively little intervention in it. As we get further into the 50s, and this is probably what gets many people to Rapa Nui, Tor Heyerdahl went there, and he was the first person to do island-wide excavations. So Routledge did a few small ones, which is mainly mapping and interviewing people. But we get Tor Heyerdahl, who comes with a team, it's an international team from Norway, but quite a lot of Americans on the team. First island-wide excavations, so we suddenly got some data that's beneath ground, but it's also, he creates a sort of romantic book about it, Aku Aku, which encourages that idea that it's a romantic and special place, that gives it a special kind of world heritage ethos just by the mystery of it. And in fact, I got to Easter Island because of Aku Aku. I was doing field work in Italy. I was on a beach on a day off, and somebody was reading Aku Aku, and they said, "Sue, this is just wonderful. Why don't we go?" So we did. Today, Rapa Nui has got all sorts of issues to do with how its heritage is managed, and how you as an archaeologist can work on Rapa Nui. The national park, which is the UNESCO landscape, is managed by Chilean National Parks Authority, which is actually a national forestry commission, which I always find very funny, because when I go up to see them on Rapa Nui, I say, do you like being here? And they say, well, there aren't many trees. But they are very keen to get traditional trees back, so they're managing it. And the whole landscape's divided into sectors which they manage, and you can see their symbols and the way they mark up the parts of the national park that can be entered into. How you control behaviour in the national park is extremely difficult, because you're dealing with monuments that are spread out on a very big and impressive scale, and tourists are just attracted to walk up to them. And this is why now, and actually working with our team, there's been a sort of discussion about what has to be fenced in and where they can walk and where they cannot. And it's governed by two things, apart from the general protection of the monument. It's covered by the idea of tapu or sacred, that you cannot mount a ceremonial monument. And there are people with whistles constantly trying to get tourists off sacred locations. So there's a clash between a Polynesian idea of sacred and the mainly Western tourists that are going there. So that's an issue. A second issue is just, it is the main financing of the island. So you have to accommodate tourists and things tourists wish to look at and see. So it's the main economy that comes into the island. There's also the actual damage of continuously walking certain places and not other places. So CONAF have increasingly asked us to find walkways and passages and routes across this heritage landscape that in our mind benefit what tourists can see but don't damage what is there. Of course, that's Chileans managing by the National Park Authority the landscape, and we have to work with that as archaeologists. But the Rapa Nui themselves have created a great bitterness about what's happened to their landscape, that they've been moved off it, and that they have their ancestral landscape there, and that they have rights, they have ancestral rights to it. So since the 1960s, there's been constant tension between the Chilean government, the national park, and the Rapa Nuis as to what you can do in the landscapes of Rapa Nui. And more recently, 2 years ago, they set up roadblocks. They just set them up so you couldn't go to the main ceremonial sites, and you were checked off, you had to get permission to go through, etc. I mean, of course, all during that time, no money could be taken from tourists to look at the sites either. So all sorts of complications as to how you manage the landscape. So that's a kind of evolving heritage contact of Europeans down to the present. I just want to pick out a few heritage myths that sort of really stands clearly in Rapa Nui, and then I want to go on to the work we've been doing and how we interface with all these issues. It's a great disservice to Rapa Nui to have the name or the idea that it is the island that self-destructed, and this is Jared Darman's phrase and work. Clearly, it lacks trees. The treed things you see are other Polynesian islands. It's clear that there were once trees there. So in our intervention work and excavation, you can see the roots of palm trees which are in soil profiles. They're very fine palm tree roots, so you can really recognise them when they're there. So there are very few palm trees there now, but there were palm trees. So it's true that trees were removed, but whose fault was it? Is it a Rapa Nui human eco-disaster? Quite interestingly, Terry Hunt's work, and also where we've found palm nuts in fieldwork, they're gnawed by rats. And the first colonisers that came to Rapa Nui brought the Polynesian rat. And it's extremely productive. So there's rats across the island within about 100 years of arrival, and they eat the palm nuts. So the trees which are left cannot regenerate. So blame the rats, not just the Rapa Nuis. the outcomes of doing it are part of the myth. So there are many myth stories about what happens if you cut down trees. You have no access to trees. There's issues about the quality of the soil and whether you can grow crops in the same way without trees. There's ideas that it led to starvation and various types of interpretations of small statues. I mean, they could be ghosts, they don't have to be starved people, but this has been put on them. There's ideas of warfare, looking at certain equipment, which is very common. This equipment, which are called matai, we're doing microware on them, and others have done too. And they're actually used for cutting vegetables. They're not used for killing people. You can't go to sea if you have no trees. And so you can't get away. And if you have no major wood, you cannot necessarily move statues, which we will move on to. So there's a kind of myth of Rapa Nui that all these things came together and society collapsed. And this is why we have collapsed statues: starvation, lack of trees, warfare. And that collapse is potentially there because you cannot move statues, because statues are part of the way of creating status, worshipping the ancestors, etc. So there's a kind of network of ideas going together, which include that the statues are really the most important part of the heritage and that they can't be moved. Who knows how they move them? I just give all the attempts to try and do it. But what I now want to do is, I've sort of given you some constructs on which people have thought about its heritage. I want to look at our project. Our project wasn't about heritage. It was to look at these prehistoric landscapes and how they were constructed and how that created connections between places and a social framework for Rapa Nui. We've got masses of people on the project, and I just list them there. It's based at UCL, but we have lots of components of people from Rapa Nui itself. And you need to do all this. You need to bring CONAF, the National Park on board. You need to bring the museum on board. You need to bring other aspects of Rapa Nui, such as the Marahi Atam, who we are working with, is actually part of mapping Rapa Nui to give land back. And I think that's very important, the role between archaeologists and mapping what's on the ground and how that relates to Chile's decision to give land back. So I've got 3 examples of the work we're doing. One is the most recent of our work. So this was last January. I was at a point that it was getting very difficult to get permissions to do anything on Rapa Nui because archaeologists are seen as telling stories that the locals don't believe, creating a heritage history that's not the one they believe. They don't like people touching monuments, measuring them, etc. So what we did last January was say, what would you like done? And they said they'd like a survey of Poika. Poika is an old shield volcano. It's one of the oldest volcanic structures on Rapa Nui. It's completely devoid of vegetation, and it is suffering massively from erosion, such that whole ceremonial platforms are falling into the sea. So by saying we would do a study of erosion, what we have done for the first time is actually being able to walk on top of ceremonial monuments, because we're studying their erosion and we're allowed to look at them. So it's a kind of sequence of access. We're working very interestingly with Paolo Tupano, who's the great-grandson of the Tupano that assisted Catherine Routledge. So there's a kind of family thread going there. And we're in the middle of a eucalyptus woodland, which I'll come to. So Rapa Nuians are blamed for this terrible landscape that we see. They've destroyed their own prehistoric heritage through mismanagement. Well, it's quite clear that the worst thing that happened was William Zimbarfor, when they brought sheep onto the island in the 20th century, they introduced grass. They introduced grass from New Zealand. And if you go up onto Poika, they also did different subsistence activities. They actually started ploughing some of this bare grassland. And you can see plough strips, which are, when the soil is not grassed but was loosened, created massive erosion down. As you go across the Rapa Nui landscape, you can also see what animals do. They scuff at things. They try to get at minerals. And what they're actually doing is destroying and digging up archaeology and creating more erosion. Very dramatically, we found, as it were, the front of erosion on Poika. The people who brought the sheep and later cattle decided that shade was needed for them. So they built up areas with eucalyptus forest, and that created the front of erosion, because as the leaf litter came down from these forests, eucalyptus leaves are very oily, so as it rained, the water would just go over those leaves and out the forest and whoosh, and that's how you get the front of erosion. And it is really major. And in front of it, you can see different attempts to now plant trees to stop it. But what it's doing is this. It just takes everything away, and a few bigger stones are left pedestaled. So it's just washing out the archaeology continuously all the time. And if you're interested in archaeology beyond statues, if you're interested in settlements and smaller scale things, it's just being lost. We've started doing sort of satellite and aerial photographs just to see what's going on. I think this is the worst erosion on the island. I mean, it's just staggering. And you get great gullies carved out through where erosion will take an angle to go around some bigger monument. So where you see an arrow here and up here, what you actually have are old ceremonial monuments, old ahu, which are just being washed and worn, and the rivers of water are going either side. And here's a crematoria. All that's left of it now is its different coloured stones. But what we're hoping to do, and I'm trying to get permission at the moment, is to actually now go back to those eroded monuments and sample them for environmental information and cultural information. So finally, I've actually got access to something that was part of my original project remit, to look at these ceremonial monuments. So by working with the idea of eroding heritage and what was important to local management, I've actually got access to things rather differently. So I'm going to look at two other examples. I'm going to look at these volcanoes I've mentioned. There are two major volcanoes in Rapa Nui which provide something key to its monumentality. The one you see here provides the hats, the red hats which some of the statues had placed on top of them. The other one we'll look at is the statue quarry. But what we were interested in was understanding how these quarries functioned. What Conaf, who managed the land, was interested in was, where can we put walkways and pathways for the public to visit these sites? How can we get some interpretive information that we can give to the public? So we sort of worked between the two, and what we tried to do was find out what was underground. We can see what you have to avoid walking over above ground, but are there things that would be damaged below ground? And clearly lots is going on in this crater. It's got lots of humps and bumps, mainly spoils from excavating the hats. So we did a type of resistivity called tomography, where you take transects or lines, and within it you can get a depth of variable resistance, and you can almost create like a slice of what's underground. I mean, I'm explaining it incredibly simplistically, but I think the one thing you can see is that there's a very high resistance, which is purple and red. And what we found at Punapau was actually the main track or entrance into that quarry, which interested us to think about how it was configurated, but it also meant we could say what to avoid in terms of the public route through, which was put to the side of it. We actually excavated at this site, and we excavated on the left-hand slide along where this underground trackway that we'd found was. And actually it became incredibly interesting to the narrative of the site, because what we thought were abandoned hats, which had sort of been hauled out the quarry and just abandoned, were actually placed quite deliberately right down that track or route. So they're like sort of ceremonial markers of the route in. And some of them actually had sort of key deposits underneath them, very nice stone axes, for instance. So by working on something we wanted to do, but taking the remit of giving something that CONAF wanted to know about, we actually got quite an interesting result. Here is the statue quarry. This is the most famous site on Rapa Nui. It's called Ranararaku. It's a volcano vent. You can see on the right-hand side that some of it's absolutely collapsed away, but still on the left-hand side you can see where on the outside of the quarry they've been quarrying for statues. And then the softer bits further down is all the sediment from quarrying. Now, we were just interested in the heritage story of Ranararaku. There's the idea that due to all the disasters I've mentioned, that there was a collapse in society and that people just abandoned carving statues. They couldn't move them anymore, so they abandoned them. So we're sort of interested in that story and its reality. So that's why we wanted to work at Ranararaku, to look at its chronology more carefully and think about the idea of abandonment. Well, if you begin to look carefully at what you see here, on the spoil at the bottom, there are statues. They are there. Are they abandoned statues or not? Then as you move up, you'll begin to see that it's not just lava flows, that there's carved quarry bays into that quarry. We also had some old excavations we could look at. Heyerdahl actually dug around one of those heads, and it is not a head. It is an enormous statue which has been covered by spoil. And a more recent one exposed, you can actually see that it's got carvings right down its back. So here's a major problem with the statues. They are eroding at such a state that they're actually better buried, because buried you can see all these amazing things about the carvings they have on their back. We also were trying to work with CONAF to think about routeways and passages through the quarry for people to go and look at the statues. So in that case we did ground penetrating radar, and again you can see these blips, these sort of little hotspots where there are other statues. So it's not just what you see above ground. There are many, many more statues below ground. And in our counts and other people's counts, it's not just our work, there's more than 1,000 statues at that quarry. So only a few of them go away to ceremonial platforms. So this idea that they're just abandoned seems just mad, because you wouldn't have so many all sitting there. So another idea would be that they're meant to be there, that the majority are meant to stay there. And therefore, the detail of studying them becomes incredibly important. Are they meant to stay there? Are they actually embellishments of volcanic vents? Are they the places that statues are born and its ancestors come from? By taking drone flights and aerial photographs, we get more and more information about the sheer entanglement of statues. They're like babies in maternity bays, which is what Routledge called them, waiting to be born. Statue, 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 statue. Everywhere you go, statue, 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 etc. It's a work of art, attached to the quarry. And they are inextractable. So here's one at an angle to another, and there's another up there. You cannot get them out. They're actually carved to stop the next one coming out. So by working with CONAF to actually say, it would be interesting to get more details to aid your mapping of the quarry. Much of it's been mapped manually by Joanne van Tilburg, and we're now doing it by using drones and flying over it. But what we also had an interest in was how things were taken out the quarry. So that was part of our drone survey, and we spent a lot of time looking at the faces of the quarry, not the statues. And in doing that, the most remarkable thing came out of it. The walls are carved in eyes. And maybe 2 or 3 were known, but there are many, many more. I think we've got something like 35 pairs now. And I think that's a real sort of heritage issue, because it actually begins to change the meaning of the quarry. It's a living thing. As you take statues out, they're guarded, they're phased by eyes. You can take lots of different interpretations. But sometimes you just can't get at them. They're so high up, and they are in different states of decay. And it takes something like 3D photography to actually find some of them. So here's an invisible heritage, but it's there. You can go and you can pull it out, but it's sort of invisible to the naked eye. But it very much contributes to the story of Rapa Nui. But then they say, oh, how can we conserve this? How can we sustain it? It's something that's always there in the quarry. And the answer is, I don't think you can. I mean, the amount of erosion that's constant is impossible. So I think recording is so important. And it does link the quarry into a wider story. So the statues in the quarry have no eyes. When they are taken to the ceremonial platforms, their eyes are carved out. And then occasionally they're actually activated by putting coral and scoria eyes in. So there's some relationship between blind statues in the quarry. When they're removed, there's eyes put on the quarry, and when the statues themselves are taken away, they're given eyes. So something that focused on a quarry takes you into a big journey of heritage, connecting things together rather than working as single sites or single categories of sites. Alongside that issue to do with the statues are the statues that are along statue roads. Ranuraraku is the quarry, and there's a whole series of roads radiating from it, along which there are prone statues. And sometimes you can see the roads, sometimes they're not so clear, but you can certainly see the prone statues. And we've always had an interest in whether they really are abandoned statues. It's a bit like abandoning them in the quarry, where they abandoned and transport. And we've always had an interest in whether they were something else. And there's an old picture by Heyerdahl where at the back of a statue they've actually excavated a little platform. So we've been doing geophysics at the back of these statues, these prone statues, and they do seem to be high resistance areas. So it grew as an idea, which in fact Routledge suggested, Heyerdahl suggested, and a Belgian team's been working on this as well, that maybe they're not abandoned. Maybe they're actually standing monuments along the road. So this is something we wanted to look at a little more. We've done it by geophysics, but you're not allowed to go near these things. You're not allowed to touch them, etc. But look, they're in the most amazing exposed state in the landscape. They're falling apart. So we were asked to do a weathering survey on them. Yes, please, we'll do that. Don't you worry, we'll do it. We'll check the state of it. And of course it worked so well because we started studying all sorts of things. I mean, clearly, some of them are on their back, some are on their front, so there's different states of weathering relating to that. Some have totally lost their features. I mean, this is what's happening to all of the statues in Rapa Nui, sort of gross loss of fabric. We had checklists that CONAF gave us, so we had to look for what they wanted us to look at. They wanted to know how much lamination or fracturing there was on them, and fine fractures. They wanted us to look at the amount of lichen on them, how disaggregated things are. And all this is actually very useful to their monitoring because it's all photographs they can check from year to year. They can assess priorities of which statues they work on and which they don't. The one I really liked doing was animal vulnerability. You had to look in the sky and see if there were any birds flying around that might deposit things on the statues. And then you had to look for evidence that animals had rubbed on them. And my God, they do. So the corners of the statues are very rubbed, and lots of them have horsehair on it from doing it. And this one's now put a fence around it so the horses can't go near it. So we're doing something that contributes to an understanding of the heritage state, in this case of the statue roads. And we also did 3D photography to check it. But as we did that, something else came out of it. We were back to our story of were these statues standing or not, which is our real interest. So we set up a weathering sheet to look at the fronts of the statues. If they're lying on their front, you can get underneath them, and that's what we wanted to see, because that's a protected area. So what we were interested in was, if these statues were once standing, they would have differential weathering. They have big bellies. So under the belly, where the hands are, there would be less weathering, because it's protected by the belly. Under the eyes, there'd be more weathering on the cheek and less at the protected part. So this is what we did. We mapped and looked at this, and there are clear differences that suggest that these statues were standing. The Belgian teams looked at the back of the statues, and they've come up with similar types of interpretation. So I think that's quite fun, because we did something we didn't want to do, but it actually allowed us to develop our heritage story. So these things are very entangled. I'm moving towards the last bit I want to just say a little bit about. This is to do with the landscape as a whole. I've sort of suggested that things are connected and repeated as ideas across the landscape. But one of the things we found hardest to get permission to do are landscape surveys. Something over, let's say, 2 kilometres of a landscape, because we were considered to be tampering in everywhere and difficult to observe. But we did gradually get permission to do this. And it's really important to emphasise that Rapa Nui is a whole landscape. You can't pick it off in pieces. So if you look at the ceremonial platforms, you'll see here, for instance, that they're complex, these landscapes. Ceremonial platform, ceremonial platform, ceremonial platform, carved out fronts, flattened areas for ceremonial plazas, and routeways down to the sea between them. So we have, in a whole Rapa Nui landscape, we have these amazing monuments, which some of the statues went to, which are at the interface between land and sea. And they ring the island. We have issues of what happened to them, how they collapsed. Some people say tsunamis, some people say they were deliberately collapsed as a different phase of the use of the monument, etc. And these are the constant stories of the monuments by the sea. But there's a bigger story, and I find it a really interesting story, which is they did many more things, and they did many more things with little stones. It's a heritage of little stones. It's not a heritage of big stones. What did they do? They collected stones from the sea, flat stones, and they brought them inland to make the fronts of the ceremonial platforms, and more that we will see. And they cleared huge areas of stone. So there are stone-free areas, and what do? They take them and they make rock gardens. Who cares about trees? You can protect your soil by rock mulch. And that's what they did. It's not a landscape of disaster, it's a landscape of ingenuity. It's a landscape of moving millions of little stones. As you get about 200 kilometres inland, you start getting these, which are boat-shaped houses with sea stones. So the sea stones are still being moved inland. So it's a feat of moving things. And if you look with care at these houses, they tell heritage stories. They're made of lots of different stones which don't fit together properly. And they're scavenged from other houses. Or you could say these are ancestral houses. They've taken the houses of all the other houses to make this house. And these are really magical little details about how societies work and understand their relationship with things. And what's so important out of that is, surely this is as important a heritage as the iconic heritage. This itself needs to be protected, recorded, etc. As you get a bit further in from the houses, you get chicken houses made of stones, you get crop enclosures, you get little ovens, and you get on and on and on rock gardens. And they're not just there, they have to be made. And they're made with symbolic care. So, for instance, the idea that things come from sea to land is always within it. You take coral from the beach and you put it amongst your rock gardens. And it's creating that connectivity of place. So this is actually what I enjoy doing the most on Rapa Nui. It's this landscape of little details. And it's there because the sheep company moved everybody into Hangaroa and there was this undisturbed landscape. So, very rightly and fairly, Chile is now returning land to the Rapa Nuis. So how do you do that? How do you return land after all those years? There's all sorts of issues that come with it. Where do you build? How do you designate how to build in that landscape, that heritage landscape? So archaeologists are working by plotting these little things. And the case I would make is that an oven or a crop enclosure is as meaningful as putting a fence around a statue. So that sort of negotiation of landscape is really important. The Rapa Nui freedom flag is this Tamira, which looks like a bit like a canoe with face ends, and that's just cropping up everywhere now. And it's a battle to do anything on Rapa Nui because you have these conflicting claims on land and heritage. And, you know, is a rock garden a heritage? Do we say you cannot plough that up or whatever? It needs a lot of talk and negotiation. And Rapa Nuis love building things. They'll build across the whole island quite merrily. They're always building. But perhaps I like this the most. A Rapa Nui sold this, and it's got a hotel on it now. And that's probably the most viciously attacked place on Rapa Nui. And it's meant to be artistic, but it has this great metal fence around it, the Hangaroa Hotel. But this is the level of opposition to tourism, to people from the outside managing the island, etc. It's really, really strong. So how do we get round some of these issues? You have to be patient, you have to sit there, you have to talk to many people, but you have to empower people to have their own heritage. So our project's been working with creating bursaries for Rapa Nui students to come to the UK. We've had them on training excavations. We've been working with schools to try and get them to map their own landscape. So we have Moai weathering sheets and checks sheets for them to look at not just the big famous things, but the little things. So we put a boathouse sheet, for instance, to look at those ancestral houses. You have to work with people who've the living memory, as it were, such as Paolo. You have to work with Conaf, because they've managed that place for so long and they keep the records. You have to work with the elders. This is Sorabel Fati, who, and he's died last year, but he excavated with Tor Haidal. He is a Rapa Nui elder who worked with us. And you have to work with ritual knowledge. It's not just practically how you do something. Are you actually allowed to touch something? Do you need an umu ceremony? Would that persuade everybody to join in and work with you? So there's a great delicacy with working with living heritage as opposed to heritage that's being repackaged, but it's not actually come from people that have a direct and long-term continuity with it. And my last slide is just to say a great plead for the big and the small in heritage, because it's the small things that tell you about the big things and vice versa. There's a dialogue there. And for Rapa Nui, you can only get that big and small dialogue if you do it on an island-wide scale, rather than a designated heritage landscape. So how landscapes are designated and the scale of them and what they contain is really important to a heritage creation. Well, that's it. I've introduced Rapa Nui, and there you are.
Thank you very much, Sue. I think you've earned more than a glass of water. Thank you very much.
Now's the time for questions. Can I please ask you, when you raise your hand, to actually say your name and your affiliation? It just simply helps to contextualise the question that's being asked. So who's going to go first? Yes?
Olga Brooks, affiliations to husband, teaches at UCL. I have a question about the people. You said 4,000 people.
Yeah.
Are they actual descendants of the original race?
No. So by the time Routledge got there were 250 people. So if you want, that's a bank we know of. And even at that stage, it was quite a mixed population. I always think that every sailor passed through Rapa Nui eventually. I mean, if you go to Rapa Nui, there's no consistency. It looks very multicultural. So from that 250 that's multicultural already, so there's an increasing input by Chileans, because obviously they're managing it and there are Chilean businesses there. And now it's 4,000 people of many different categories. So giving back land becomes almost racist. It can only be given to a Rapa Nui. You can only build something on Rapa Nui land if you're a Rapa Nui. Well, how do you prove you're a Rapa Nui? It's not always the way you look. And it's almost got to the point there's legal disputes where there's DNA testing. And they, what percentage? If it's 80% Rapa Nui or however you do the DNA. So it's a very difficult issue to have this idea to only Rapa Nuis should have access to controlling their heritage, etc., or building in the landscape.
Another question? I'm seeing several hands. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Simon Madison, I just completed the Masters at the Institute. Could you say something about the economy of Rapa Nui as it was perhaps at the beginning of the 20th century and how it is now? Because it seems to me that's the key part of how you make this sustainable.
Yes, it really was it was dependent on ships from Chile supplying it. And even when I went there 10 years ago, there'd be sort of like warehouses with nothing in it, and then a plane or a ship would come in from Chile with a lot of a particular resource. So it was mainly dependent on supplies in the 20th century. I mean, obviously they have certain resources for subsistence, but they're very minimal. It's got very low biodiversity. Chickens, bird eggs. There are no pigs or larger animals until quite recently. So it was fish, birds, eggs, birds, taro as a crop. So it wasn't really something that was easy to sort of do more than subsistence. Once Chile brought things in, they still really didn't have much of a life subsistence-wise. But the thing that changed it was in the 60s, the Americans were looking for a space shuttle landing stage. So they looked around the Pacific somewhere where there wouldn't be a sort of major accident anywhere else, and they put it on Easter Island. So this amazing landing stage was made. So that created a runway, and then flights could come in. And that's really when tourism began to take off. So now it's wholly is the major thing. You make your subsistence or economy through tourism, and it's mainly female orientated. I mean, it's mostly females that run hotels. I sometimes wonder what a lot of males do on Rapa Nui. Race horses, and of course there's sculpture and things like that, but it is tourism. That's what they have. It's quite a good season, it's quite a long season. So it's not just like 6 months of the year. You could go there any time of the year. There's a rainy season. But that's the change. And so they're dependent on tourism, and therefore if you're thinking about heritage, you have to work with tourist accessibility and what would be helpful and encouraging for tourists. So one of the things I've been doing with CONAF is saying the average stay on Easter Island is 3 days. What can we do? It can't sustain more people coming in. There are not enough lavatories or whatever. It can't do it. There's got very little water. But the thing to do is not get more people in, but make the people who stay longer. So we're creating walking trails and trying to take people away from just going to Rapa Nui, the statue quarry.
Martin Michette, I'm a doctoral student on the CR program. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the tradition of quarrying or sculpture making. Firstly, if there's any indication of when it ceased, and secondly, if you've been able to find any of the tools that were used.
Yeah.
And finally, if you think there's any appetite or capacity for restarting it somehow, or at least reinvestigating the tradition of stonemasonry.
Right. The statue quarry is the worst dated thing on the island because they won't allow excavation. So it's very difficult. But Tor Heyerdahl, when he excavated, he went through spoil heaps from sort of quarrying, and there are layers and layers of charcoal. So what I've been trying to do for years is to say, can I go back through these sections and get some dating? So there isn't a close dating of it. Poona Pau, the hack quarry, because I have excavated there and was allowed to, we are getting dates now, and they're quite spread out. They go from about 1300 to 1650, that sort of range. So it may be longer than the idea that things stopped at 1550, but it's several hundred years these sites are working for. So you were asking about the dates. It's not as good as it can be, and I would expect from all these charcoal horizons I thought ran over that it's got several hundred years of working on it, which is different to knowing when it stopped. You ask if this could be work done on the tools, etc. These quarries are littered in tools, absolutely littered, to the point that I could actually call upon Polynesian cosmology, where the idea is that in Polynesia, mining and canoe building are sacred activities. They're actually male activities, and you cannot take your tools with you. They have to be left in a sacred place. So you could think of something like Rapa Nui as a sacred volcano. It's so littered with tools, I think it must be that they have to stay there. That's their place. So there's masses of them, absolutely masses of them. And what we're trying to do now, Joanne van Tilburg, who works there, and others, including myself, are looking at the quarries they might have come from, which you can do by sort of various X-ray techniques, portable, XRF, etc. And we have found the quarries where the stone came from to make the tools. Was there a third question I haven't answered?
Yeah, just if you think there's any appetite for this tradition being rekindled, if there's any.
Right, Tor Heyerdahl kind of tried getting his team in Rapa Nui to make a statue, carve it out, and it's still there, half carved in the quarry. And it was quite good to understand how long it took. The appetite is in wood now, I would say. People do things in stone. There's quite nice modern stone sculpture, and there's a lot of sculpture in wood now because larger pieces can be brought into the island, and you can use things like eucalyptus. So I think, and probably it's a good thing, that it's a modern invention that's coming forward, and there is some fantastic woodwork, really good. And they do quite a lot of copies of the smaller statues, which are already catalogues of, that Haidar and others took out the country and are in various museums. And they sell for a lot of money, actually, so there is a trajectory of artistic financing.
Okay, hello, my name is Eva and I've just finished my Masters in Sustainable Heritage here at the Institute. You said there were issues with the local people, even though there's issues with like who's really local, they don't like touching either statues or measuring them. So there's certain degree of information being passed through the generations. Are there any like local tales and legends associated to the quarry that might explain why there are some statues still left there and the existence of the art?
So there was a sort of German padre who was there in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he wrote a book on the legends of Easter Island. And I actually found some of them quite interesting. I'd read them and suddenly think, oh, I noticed that. So for instance, they talked about taking coral and white stone from the coast and putting it on the land to bring rain. And that was what I was finding in these rock gardens. So that was interesting. There's a local tradition, if you say how did they move the statues, they always say they walked. They always say they walked. And it's kind of an idea, but maybe the spirit of them walks. So there's all sorts of things. So that there is some usefulness in it. I'd say better is looking at Polynesian more widely, rites and beliefs. For instance, they're incredibly well documented on Hawaii. There are spirit roads they talk about. They have all sorts of things, interest in different meanings of stone. Stones are living, stones are animate, much better documented there. But the 250 people that Catherine Routledge met are, they've got their own creation that's an interrupted one. But there are many things we're told today, and you don't know where they come from. I mean, that's what they say. You put a stone in a place to attract chickens. Well, that's what the person I live with says. That's a chicken stone there. Well, I accept it, but I don't know if it's come from 20 years ago, 40. My uncle told me, well, yes, and then you can't get down the next train. But they make you think differently, and I think that's important. It gives you another line of inquiry.